Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. Delighted to see you here on sunny afternoon. We decided, a collective decision, no referendum needed, that we'd all have our shirt sleeves on for this. This event is part of our series, Scotland in a Changing UK, Unionist Visions for further devolution after the referendum. I emphasise that because that we will be having an event later which representatives of the SNP and Plaid have been invited to set out their respective constitutional visions. And we also had a discussion last October with leading commentators, including the nationalists, but this event is from the Unionist vision. I was pointed out by Akash Pound, who runs the project, that we're exactly 15 years to the day since the Scottish Parliament resumed its activities after an interval of a few months and centuries. It's exactly the anniversary of that. In less than 100 days' time, the Scottish people will cast their votes on whether or not to leave the UK. Current polls predict a victory for the no side, but I think few people believe the Unionist victory will mark the end of the debate. We certainly don't believe that here. We believe that this is a continuing debate, and a no vote will actually produce a very interesting period of debate for the whole UK, and particularly for intergovernmental relations within the UK. So what we want to discuss is the implications of the proposals put forward by the three unionist parties in recent weeks and months, and in fact the joint statement which the Scottish leaders of the three main parties have put forward, clearly putting forward a view that there has to be a further development of the devolution settlement in the event of a no vote. This event, as I said, is part of the Institute's Governing After the Referendum project, which is exploring the challenges that we face in ensuring effective government across the UK in the aftermath of September the 18th. It's funded by the ECRC as part of the Future of the UK and Scotland Research Programme, which is coordinated by the University of Edinburgh. I'm very glad to be partners of the University of Edinburgh in that. Now, we've got three speakers today. Anna Sarwar, MP, Deputy Leader of Scottish Labour and a member of the party's Devolution Commission. To my right, Peter Duncan, a former Scottish Conservative MP, which does single him out. It's not a very exhausting pub quiz to name the Scottish Conservative MPs since 1997.
It isn't.
Peter was one of them. He's now a strategic communications consultant. And to my left is Jeremy Purvis, who's now a member of the House of Lords, was a member of the Liberal Democrat Home Rule Commission, and a former MSP for Tweedale, Etterick and Lauderdale, a wonderful part of the country. I'm tempted to say of the United Kingdom, but I'll say of Scotland, on that. Now, what we're going to do is the three speakers will speak for 5 to 10 minutes each on what their party has proposed in terms of future devolution, the rationale for these proposals, and how such reforms would affect the relationship between the UK and Scotland and their respective governments. After the three speeches, starting with Anna, then Peter, then Jeremy, we'll have a discussion which I will lead, picking up some common themes, where it goes forward, particularly after September the 18th, and then there'll be some QAs on that. So I say this is part of our broader programme. This is one event in a broad programme, and a broad research programme. So I'm delighted to see you here. Anna.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. As Peter's already said, today does mark the 15th anniversary of the reopening of the Scottish Parliament. I think it's an important opportunity for us to both recognise what's been achieved so far in the journey of devolution, but also to set out what we think is the next phase in that story of devolution as well. I suppose what makes me slightly different in terms of this debate is that throughout my political consciousness, there has been a Scottish Parliament. I have known no other form of government than a strong Scottish Parliament making the decisions that affect our everyday life in Scotland, but also being part of something bigger, and that is the UK Parliament as well. So in many ways, I am, like my generation, the devolution generation, those who have always lived with that best of both worlds approach, where they've preferred cooperation and partnership over isolation and division. I think it's also important to set out at this early stage about Labour's own commitment to devolution. That's why we have set up the Devolution Commission that looks at the next stage of devolution. That wasn't set up as some kind of political fix. It's not some kind of auction on powers, and it's not an attempt to out-nationalise the nationalists. Instead, it's a genuine attempt to look at where power best lies to meet the aspirations of the Scottish people, both at a local level, national level, but indeed an international level as well. That's why I'm proud that my party, its founder, first stood on a manifesto commitment of Home Rule for Scotland that we led in terms of the setting up of the Constitutional Convention. Despite the criticisms of the nationalists, we, within 2 months of winning the 1997 landslide, had a referendum in Scotland to set up the Scottish Parliament. Within 2 years, set up that Scottish Parliament. And then Wendy Alexander, when she was leader of the Scottish Party, put in place the Calman Commission, which brought forward the proposals for the recent Scotland Act that was passed by the coalition government. And further to that, we've now, as I say, put out our proposals in the Devolution Commission. I think it's important just to set out a couple of principles of devolution from the outset, because I think that feeds into the wider conversation that we're going to have. When the Scottish Parliament was created, it wasn't an attempt to shift power from one building in London to another building in Edinburgh, and now that one party has a majority, to one man sitting in Bute House. Instead, it was a genuine attempt to shift power, wealth and democracy to individuals and communities right across the country. And sadly, we've seen a centralising government in Edinburgh, not a devolution government in Edinburgh, and that's why a key focus of our commission was not just powers from Westminster to Holyrood, but also from Holyrood to local government as well. Secondly, I think a fundamental principle that's important is that actually Peter mentions about this debate going on after the referendum. Constitutional politics doesn't change anybody's life. What power a politician has or hasn't changes no politician's life or no person's life apart from the politician themselves. What a politician chooses to do with the powers they've got is actually what makes a difference in terms of achieving that social and economic change that we want to see, not just in Scotland, but right across the United Kingdom. The other point I think is important to note, particularly on the anniversary and also with the now less than 90 days to go to the referendum, is that this isn't a choice between whether you're Team Scotland or Team United Kingdom, whether you're Team Scottish Government versus Team UK Government. Instead, this is a choice about what best vision do you see for your country, Scotland, as we head to the 18th of September and beyond. And I'm sure the case I make, as I'm sure Jeremy and John make as well, is that the vision we see is one of partnership and cooperation, not walking away and division. So that's the principles that we looked on when we put together our proposals in the Devolution Commission. A Devolution Commission which took evidence from right across the country from external stakeholders, but also looked at how we can best, as I say, meet the aspirations of the Scottish people. So some of those recommendations, I won't go through them all in detail, otherwise I need more than the 10 minutes that's been allotted to me. First was about actually accountability for the Parliament, and that's why we would enshrine the Scottish Parliament into the statute. There is no suggestion that any government would choose to dissolve the Scottish Parliament, but the power does exist for Westminster to dissolve the Scottish Parliament if it wished. And one of the reasons why we'd institute that and make it in the statute book in our constitution is because it ends that fear and that scaremonger that some say that we might choose to depower the Parliament rather than empower the Parliament after the elections. Secondly, we would look at how we can increase the accountability of the Parliament, and that's why we would give it responsibility for raising more of its own budget. So we would put that up to 40% of its own budget being raised in Scotland. Therefore, the debates that we have around our Scottish Parliament elections would not just be on spending, but would be on tax and spending, giving much more responsibility to the Parliament, and therefore transferring not just the 3p tax powers that we had in the initial settlement up to the 10p tax powers that came in the Calman Commission proposals, but up to the 15p that gives 3/4 of basic rate income tax raised and spent in Scotland on Scotland's priorities, however the Scottish Government wished. Further to that, we would introduce a progressive rate of taxation, meaning that we could reintroduce the 50p tax band if we so wished, so we could increase the higher rate and the top rate of tax if we felt there were specific spending priorities that needed to be matched in Scotland in terms of the constraints of the current budgets or budgets going forward. Then we looked at welfare and employability powers. That's why we would devolve housing benefit to Scotland, so we could, if we so wished, abolish the bedroom tax, and also we could work with the housing benefit powers and the money that comes from housing benefit to tailor a much more responsible social housing policy in Scotland as well. We'd devolve attendance allowance, so that we could finally move towards the bringing our social policy into the 21st century, a new Health and Social Care Act that integrated healthcare and social care and also fed in attendance allowance into that as well. And a final feature in terms of welfare powers is around local markets and local market reform. We all know that if you actually look at cities and city regions, as well as different localities around the islands and also the rural communities or the coastal communities, is there are specific needs in Scotland that aren't matched actually by either government, by either the Westminster government or indeed the Scottish government. That's why we would look to devolve the work programme to local government. We would look to devolve the Skills Development Scotland to local government, as well as devolve the Crown Estate to local government as well. And that does a few things for us. One is we could tailor our education policies, our training policies, and also in terms of the money we put into apprenticeships and to modern apprenticeships and to new technologies to match what local priorities are. At the same time, put in place a work programme that doesn't meet national priorities but also meets local priorities as well as strengthening the city deals that we've seen work so effectively, and Glasgow being the latest city that looks like it's going to set up a city deal with the current coalition government. And finally, what we do is, just like we'd want to set out to constitute the Scottish Parliament, so it has that set relationship with the UK Parliament, if we are going to be true to the principle of genuine devolution and to making sure communities and individuals have a real say over their lives, we would also make sure we put into statute the role of local government in delivering democracy and delivering real change. And following our publication of our proposals, Ed Miliband has made a pledge that in his first Queen's speech, if he is elected Prime Minister, there will be a new Scotland Act that puts those proposals into place to deliver those new powers quickly after the next general election. But the final thing I want to say is, whatever happens after the referendum, whatever happens in terms of whichever party wins the next election, one thing that we need in Scotland is not a constant discussion about powers, but actually a constant discussion about that genuine economic and social change. And what people want in Scotland is not two governments constantly fighting with each other and bickering with each other, but actually putting into place real, genuine partnership agreements so both governments work for the common good to actually constitute and deliver welfare rights, social rights and economic opportunities for all. That's why I'm in politics, that's why I want us to win this referendum, and that's why I want Scotland to have the best of both worlds. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That kicks off a very interesting definition of the Labour position on taking forward actually very quickly. I mean, answering one of the questions I wanted to do later. Now, Peter, I mean, in a sense there was a surprise recently with the Trust-Tide Commission that the Conservatives in Scotland have been quite cautious for a time, and this appeared to be a kind of big leap. So where do the Tories stand on this?
Indeed, Peter, absolutely. And good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and put a Conservative point of view, a small C, a Conservative point of view, I should stress, in that I'm not a formal spokesman for the party, but I hope I will provide some insight and some support and a bit of critique. And the balance of that is probably different as it would have been about a month ago, because I think this is a very important time that a centre-right perspective needs to find its place in this enhanced devolution debate. And I have to say, on balance, delighted with how the Strathclyde Commission has brought forward its proposals, as it did only 3 or 4 weeks ago. I should say at the start, unlike Anna's, my political history goes back just slightly before devolution, just slightly, not too far, but just slightly. But it goes back through a period of time where the Scottish Conservative Party has gone through a decline which is unspeakable. From that period of 1975, where the Conservative Party changed its view on devolution, in my view mistakenly, but it changed its view on devolution and became hostile in general to that proposal for Scotland. That then set in train a 35 or 40 year period of almost consistent electoral decline. And from my perspective, I think any reasonable assessment would be that the two are intrinsically linked as far as the Scottish political climate is concerned. I think there are two fundamental perspectives that any small c Conservative would want to cling to in considering the devolution landscape in Scotland. And I think they're important in as much as trying to establish how this is going to be a process that comes to an end to a set of stable proposals, rather than becomes a never-ending devolution process. And I think those two concepts are, firstly, localism, and secondly, accountability. I think the Conservative principle that should be, and at various points over the last 40 or 50 years have been, at the heart of Conservative principles has been localism, but there seems to have been, as far as Scotland's concerned, frankly, a blind spot. That during those phases of localist philosophy, we've believed that transferring powers to low levels is a good thing to do, but, brackets, apart from Scotland. Clearly that is fairly incoherent, and I'm glad that the Strathclyde Commission has brought that phase to an end. So I think that localism is a philosophical basis for Conservative policy. I think it's one where an enhanced and progressive approach to devolution for Scotland very neatly sits. The second principle I would regard is accountability. In my view, the Scottish Parliament was set up in a way which was inherently unsustainable. It wasn't the right thing to do to create a Parliament which spent other people's money rather than having the pressure of raising it itself. So what we've had is a situation for the last 15 years to the day is a Parliament which has enjoyed the liberty of making spending decisions without actually having to take the tough decisions which come with making additional spending. And it has always had the get out, which is, everything would be all right if we just got a bigger cheque from Westminster. And I think over the next number of years, next 4 or 5 years, I think, we will see that finally an end to that, where a situation will clearly emerge where the Parliament is responsible for a very significant proportion of its own spending. And I think that's a good thing. Where I so the Scottish Conservative proposals do go considerably, I have to say, further than Labour proposals. They radically propose the complete transfer of income tax in its entirety, whether that's bands, whether it's rates, doesn't include personal allowances and doesn't include tax on savings, but essentially the vast majority of income tax responsibility would transfer its entirety to Holyrood. Where I would move on to my critique phase of the Conservative proposals is I think there's a little bit of intellectual incoherence in my mind in proposing the transfer of income tax without proposing the transfer of corporation tax. In my mind, the two, there are many companies who are effectively taxed on income tax basis, if you're a limited liability partnership, for example, or if you're a small trader. But if you're a larger corporation, a limited company, you're taxed on corporation tax. And I think to have those two taxes accounted for in different parliaments is no longer term a mistake. And I have a philosophical attraction to the need to, as is being progressed in Northern Ireland, all the soundings coming out of that negotiation are that there's a relative positive feel about that negotiation. But clearly there are other countries in the world that manage to survive with different states in the US, with different corporate taxation bases. I think that would work for in Scotland too. So I don't stick rigidly to the Conservative proposal. Where I would summarise it as being, it is a radical transformation on where we've been recently. I welcome it. I think it has the potential for putting us once more in the middle of the most important debate that Scotland has. And frankly, for the last political generation, we haven't been there. But I do think there is some more to go. And I think fundamentally, if we can keep in our minds those twin aspirations of localism and accountability, I think those two guidance mechanisms will draw us to a stable devolution settlement, which is a parliament that's accountable and that brings power closer to people rather than keeps it further away. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, on that. Very, very interesting themes coming out, which I want to explore later. The view that might lead to a new settlement, and we'll see on the stability on that, because I think it's interesting, and you were saying this, wanting to get beyond the constitutional debate. We'll come back to that. Jeremy.
Thank you. Similarly with Peter and Anas, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I think Peter's indicated that I did have the privilege of representing the most beautiful part of both Scotland and the United Kingdom. They're not different. And although
I was trying to show my impartiality.
One of my colleagues who's a bit of a wag, when I took my title as Purvis of Tweed, they just thought, are you hedging your bets? Because if the referendum goes the wrong way, it's very easy just to move to the other side of the Tweed to Northumberland rather than the Scottish borders, but that is not the case, absolutely not. I was there on the opening of the Scottish Parliament. I was not a member of it, but I was in the gallery, and as a 25-year-old, it was a very exciting thing to witness the creation of a new entity which was about governing. And I know that, like Lord Robertson and others in this room, have got much greater experience and background than I had had. But certainly as far as a practitioner and a student of politics, there was something very exciting to be part of that. And I can understand now, part of the debate that we have in Scotland, that there will be many people excited about then what's next, and for some hold a sincere view for independence. But I think it's very interesting for those of us that don't share that argument as to how we shape, from our perspectives, what's the best way of having a legislative competence and then governance. And to some extent, when I was elected in 2003 to the Scottish Parliament, it was an election on normal politics. If you can recall, it was a mildly controversial thing called the Scottish Parliament building, and £430 million of expenditure. And that was right in the middle of that campaign. There had been crisis in the pupil qualifications agency, etc. It was a normal political election in many respects in the Scottish Parliament, and you think that is what, to a very large extent, what political processes should be about, and democratic institutions. When I was elected, I was on the Finance Committee. I served in the Finance Committee in Holyrood for 5 years. I was MSP for 2 terms, and I'd become quite clear in my own mind that the way that the Scottish Parliament had been established, impressive as it was to create a new legislature in the United Kingdom, had not created a Scottish government. And in many respects, we are still in the process of having a fully functioning, very capable, professional and competent Parliament and a legislature, but we are still defining the issues of actually how you have fully functioning government. And when I published, it's now exactly 10 years ago, a paper, Fiscal Federalism, on behalf of my own party, the Scottish Liberal Democrats, I wanted to enter our party into discussions about how we would make the devolution settlement stronger and more sustainable. I had seen the situation that unless we had provided the right balance of accountability and incentive for MSPs, then we would have a skewed system. The party then took some of the proposals that we had, and the former presiding officer and party leader, David Steele, chaired a commission for us to establish what we argued were the strongest principles for which those balance lay. And it was founded on a very long-standing view that Liberals and Liberal Democrats have had about governance across the whole of the United Kingdom. Home rule all round, or federalism, depending on your terminology, how you wish to look at it. So it was, to some extent, a refresh of those proposals. And the Steele Commission was the first document to be presented to the Calman Commissioners when they sat, when there was cross-party agreement to look at whether there was the right balance of responsibilities and incentives in the Scottish Parliament. When, after in the last Parliament, Willie Rennie, the Scottish Party leader, argued that the Steele Commission and our proposals for Home Rule needed to be refreshed and needed to be considered in the context of going forward for Scotland, we worked hard to put forward what we would consider to be a liberal federal solution, but one where we could take the core elements of what a federal relationship with Scotland and the rest of the UK could be, acknowledging that you wouldn't necessarily have to impose that across all parts of the United Kingdom at the same time in the same way. There was a recognition the United Kingdom is a unique institution, union around the world, and therefore it does require a unique response to it. And the Campbell recommendations were taking, based upon the principles that the Steele Commission had agreed, and put real practical proposals forward after 2012 when it met, to bring the Scottish Parliament to raising more than half of its revenue, to embed the Scottish Parliament as a constitutional being in its own right within the United Kingdom, to change the relationship between the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament to be more about a relationship of spheres of authority rather than tiers of authority, so that the competence of the Scottish Parliament would exist in its own right rather than it was a decision of the UK Parliament to pass on to the Scottish Parliament to do it. And it also looked at some of the ongoing financial relationships on equalisation and distribution for the very same social reasons that Anas had said. And part of that discussion was to define what unions are, the best unions that we have across these nations, and to create the strongest narrative from our perspectives to why they should be defended. And we've been encouraged that Gordon Brown and others have discussed the strength of these unions. In many respects, the Scottish National Party are still acknowledging that there are unions that should exist across the United Kingdom. We think it's better to retain them and improve them rather than to leave them and then seek to rejoin on poorer terms. But we put forward the proposals, and we were at that time, I think it's fair to say that we were not persuading other parties to move as fast as we were, but it's been very encouraging that with think tanks and the other parties, we've really seen movement, which has culminated most recently in the cross-party commitment of the three-party leaders in Scotland to move to guarantee the development of further powers for the Scottish Parliament. In the meantime, there's the R. Campbell 2 paper that we published early this year, which mapped out a time frame and a roadmap as to how we would get to a situation where we have the strengthened union, a refreshed union, as I call it. One of the recommendations for that was indeed a cross-party commitment, and that has happened. The other recommendation was that in the lifetime of the new UK Parliament, what had been agreed for Scotland would be delivered in good time and in good order. That's broadly been accepted, and the parties have committed it to. Then what we now have is the challenge for our relationship for Scotland with the other nations in the United Kingdom and reforms to Whitehall and Westminster. We know that we cannot impose that on the other nations in the UK, and we know that it has to be a process of dialogue with the institutions that we would like to effectively become federal institutions, even though they may not be termed federal as such. And that requires, I think, another process of cross-party consideration. I've put forward the proposal for a conference of the new union. The former First Minister Jack McConnell today is talking in very similar terms, so that we have an opportunity of delivering the further powers to the Scottish Parliament to put it on a permanent, what ultimately could be a destination of devolution for Scotland, and then make sure that they are fitted within a more holistic view of the strength of the United Kingdom overall, the role that Wales plays into it, and governance within England. And importantly, what Whitehall institutions and the way that the Westminster Parliament operates for that. So I'll leave it at that, because I think where we are going forward on the basis of a no vote on the referendum would be a process in Scotland that the Secretary of State, Alistair Carmichael, has announced to be convened within 30 days of a conference of the New Scotland, to allow there to be the discussions in advance of the general election that, as we've discussed, would be delivered post-general election. But also, there will be a window of opportunity to discuss exactly what we need to do to make sure that the Union is strong and has a strong narrative for the strengths that we believe are inherent, but we need to communicate much more. And a critical element of that is the governance of England. We're not qualified to dictate what they are, but we wish to do what we can to create the space for where those discussions should take place and will result in action rather than just more and more and more talk. So it is action that we are wanting to see. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeremy. Could I, before opening it up, explore some of the thoughts which actually have come out in parallel ways from the three of you? The sense of, let's say there's a no. September the 19th, all get up after celebrating or whatever. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, Alistair Marshall promised a great conclave 30 days later. Isn't there a danger from your English colleagues of saying, phew, well, that can go on, that in sense the joint statement of the Scottish leaders is a kind of temporary phenomenon, and it'll be very difficult to sustain the energy and direction you got afterwards? Anas?
Well, first of all, no, because yes, we've had a joint statement from Scottish leaders about the more powers guarantee, but that's also been a commitment from all three UK leaders, from David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg. And I think the important point coming out of the referendum, it'll be a late night on the 18th, but on the 19th is not just to say, hopefully if we win, job done, let's normal politics resume. Actually, I think there'll be a much bigger job of work to be done, and that is Scotland, through the process of the referendum, will be very much a divided nation. So that'll be families divided, it'll be internal divides, whether we divide as a country or not, but there'll be internal divides, and I think there'll be a responsibility on us as the main opposition party in Scotland, but also a responsibility on the coalition government in terms of for the Tories and the Lib Dems, and indeed a responsibility on the nationalists to put in play very, very quickly a process that is not just reconciliation in terms of warm words, but actually is a process of bringing the country back together again, a settled will on the constitution, and a return to real politics and talking about that social and economic change.
But Peter, you're aware from your period in the House when you were one, and there's one now, and that will remain true until, almost by definition,
Stop smiling on us.
I'm just laughing. Peter's mentioned it 4 times now.
Until May next year, is that your English colleagues won't share the commitment which Tom Trustline made, or David Cameron's endorsed it, that inevitably minds will turn elsewhere, and therefore sustaining what you're saying now will be harder, because to say, look, we want to have legislative time on this, we want to make these commitments, which have wide-ranging implications for the rest of the UK.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Again, it's helpful that I've got the word former in front of my party commitment. I think there has been a missed opportunity. It is more of a political opportunity than I feel like a governmental opportunity. But I think the joint statement that the leaders have made a couple of weeks ago, as an observer of that, I wasn't party to it. As an observer of it, I think it didn't go very far in my mind. I think it would have been helpful to have, long before now, to have agreed in some detail exactly what powers would be devolved immediately after a no vote, so that in that discussion you referred to, Peter, in the immediate aftermath of a no vote, there is complete clarity as to what all parties are agreed on delivering. Now, I think that's a political problem for the no campaign over the next 90 days, I have to say, but I think clearly the joint statement is better than nothing. I think the other point that's worth raising in response to your question, Peter, is clearly there is a UK implication to this, and it's easy in Scotland to if you like, in the same way as Scotland, as the rest of the UK, and during my time in Westminster, was only its attention drawn to Scotland on certain political phases and certain occasions. The same is true in Scotland, in that now and again we have to think of the implications for the rest of the UK, and there are significant implications, and I don't shy away from them in saying that in my party, as in all of the parliamentary parties, there will need to be some significant thought into what happens as asymmetric devolution gets ever more asymmetric, and that has implications that the public in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are going to start thinking about, and I think they're right to do so. I don't have to say have the golden bullet of a solution. There is I think the Lib Dems, in fairness to them, have the ultimate solution, which is a federal UK. There are significant difficulties in that, in my mind, particularly the lack of aspiration to date of such devolution to England. And regional government in England, which I think has got to be sorted.
No. But Jeremy, on that, I mean, how does the UK question get answered? Because in Wales there are quite deep differences, but there is a Silk process, a Silk 2. A lot of things being put on hold effectively until after September the 18th, and therefore, how can the UK-wide debate, which you referred to, be taken forward?
I think one of the things that I think hopefully we all acknowledge within Scotland, as far as those that don't support independence, I think we are sensitive to the fact that for the other nations in the UK, this is an existential issue for them, because what Scotland is debating is whether or not the whole union is effectively dissolved, rather than just there being a normal political debate within one part of it. And therefore, I agree with Anas that there will be an element of needs to be a process post within Scotland and then within the United Kingdom. I actually think that it's perhaps easier than what you may say, because I don't detect at the moment that there will be a backlash, as in, okay, well, you've had your say, now you're going to pay for it. That's part of a bit of a narrative that's been put forward in the referendum debate. I don't detect that. I actually think that the flip side to that is that there will be a hunger to make sure that this doesn't happen again in our lifetime. And that's a bigger imperative. And I think that in addition to the fact that there will be the necessity of addressing what is so clearly there, which is a desire in other parts of England to address the dominance of London in the southeast, that Ed Miliband this week, the Chancellor most recently talking about HS3 in the northern cities, that this is a debate that is now, to some extent, has been stimulated by it, but it does need to be there. Now, is the solution the neat subdivision of England, which we could be debating for very, very many long times? I mean, Paul from Cornwall would have maybe a very different view from colleagues from the Northwest or from Liverpool, etc., about how you create entities within England. But I think what the real prize is to recognise that it is a union of nations, and what are the federal characteristics that provide both the recognition of their standing within the union and also the ability for those to have cross-nations and bilateral relations with UK institutions that are not the UK institutions deciding what happens to the nations. It is much more of an interaction process. And I think that you could call it British federalism if you wish. I mean, it would be more akin to a Canadian approach rather than a German approach or a United States approach. But I certainly think that we are on our way to that, and what will come about with the further powers which are guaranteed, I think, for Scotland, is that we will be much closer to that position. And Gordon Brown, writing in the New Statesman recently, I think I agree with quite a lot of what he said on that. I think he was highlighting the fact that we are almost there. The lacking element is a coherent narrative that actually that pulls it all together and explains why it exists.
Yeah, I just raised the question to Anas. If you what Gordon Brown said last week, going back to the devolution debates in the 1970s, it was well, there was a real division in Scottish Labour. And what the interesting thing was and also in Welsh Labour, the thing which united the young Neil Kinnock and Robin Cook was opposition to devolution on actually social democratic grounds, that they feared that actually devolving tax and spending powers would reduce what had been a century-long Labour story, which was a central budget would be able to redistribute and so on. And that, in the proposal, devolution of housing benefit and attendance allowance. Now, it's carefully guarded. You want to retain the Barnett formula, so you retain a central element of distribution there. But there is a recognition that there will be a distinction in the way a social democratic government would approach things, and there will be limits for, if there was an Ed Miliband government next year, on its ambitions at the Tweed.
I think if you look at the debate that's happening about further devolution in Wales, the devolution in Northern Ireland, the debate that we're having this week, indeed it's a debate we've had for the last year or so around further devolution within England, around city and city regional deals, and also the speech that Ed Miliband made yesterday, and also the devolution proposals in Scotland, that I don't believe it's an either or position. I think that the fundamental thing that keeps our union strong is that pooling and sharing of resources argument, which is the one that Gordon Brown makes so eloquently. It's around how do you pool and share your resource across the United Kingdom so you redistribute wealth in an effective way and you can achieve more. And we do it with pensions, we do it with NHS spend, and such like. But where I think it differs from the 1970s debate and now is, one, I think there's been a maturing of that debate around devolution, a genuine acceptance about devolution being an accepted part of our politics, but also what's the thing behind all that frustration in the north of England and also in Scotland? I personally don't think it's a frustration with it being, actually we don't have our nationhood, we want an independent country, we want away from our neighbours. I think there's a genuine sense of frustration in many parts of England and indeed in Scotland and Wales that power is kind of centralised within Whitehall and in Westminster, and actually the power needs to be spread out in a way that you actually can tailor your social democracy in an effective way to meet local need. That's why we have a different education system, completely independent from that in England and Wales. We have an independent NHS system, completely different from that in England and Wales. A completely independent justice system in Scotland, completely different from that in England and Wales. I don't think that undermines our social democracy. I think it just tailors needs on local demand.
What about the impact? And it's a very interesting one, which has been, particularly in the Tory argument, which is, although it was originally raised by, of course, Townley, the West Lothian position. The more you go down the route of devolution, the increasingly anomalous position of Scottish representatives at Westminster. Now, there was a commission, the Mackay Commission, which tends to get forgotten, which did look at restricting the powers of Scottish and implicitly Welsh MPs on the report stages of defined English-only bills. And that's quite a challenge to define English-only bills. But did do that. That's been put on the back burner for the time being. It had some very distinguished people, former Clerk of the Commons who chaired it, and others. And is that question will inevitably come back. It won't just be about Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland also being slightly separate question, but also will affect Westminster and Whitehall, won't it be there?
Yes, I think the backbench sentiment in the Conservative Party is much more, I think, surrounding the West Lothian argument than it is at the moment on the devolved government for England and the regions of England, I have to say. I mean, it is not straightforward. I speak as someone who voluntarily abstained on every piece of what I saw as English-only legislation during my term at Westminster, until I, in a peak of flush of stupidity, managed to vote in the Mersey Tunnels Bill, which somewhat undermined the intellectual purity of my argument. But these things happen in the heat of the whip's persuasion. It's not straightforward, but I do think, on the Conservative perspective, addressing the West Lothian question is fundamental to. I mean, there is actually substantial support. I see a distinct change in Conservative opinion in the last year on progressive devolution for Scotland, I have to say. I think the mood swing has been very significant, whether it's from our leader in Scotland, who was elected with a position of a line in the sand, was the quote, and now we're in a position of being one of the most advanced progressive devolution proposals on the table at the moment. So there's significant movement. As far as England's concerned, I do think the West Lothian question gets to the heart of the remaining resentment that there is. And I remember during my term, the Foundation Hospitals debate was the one which sent the angry man phone-in programmes wild across the country when Foundation Hospitals were voted through on the support of Scottish Labour MPs at the time. So it's something that's got to be addressed. Personally, I do think the Mackay proposals are much underrated and too easily forgotten, I have to say. And there's much in there that would commend them if only there was political attention addressed to it.
Jeremy, and then
I think there were, from my reading of them, with my limited Westminster experience, I think there were some of the elements about the tabling of amendments, etc., that are possibly problematic, and I can understand it. But I think that they will have to be resolved. And certainly, if you think of by the end of the next Westminster term, or assuming that there's a no vote in the referendum, so by 2020, I think that we will have to have the element of resolution to the functioning of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Lords, I think, is easier to manage in a perverse kind of way on this issue, but because there will have been the further delivery of powers for Scotland, there is the likelihood that there will be a positive vote in a referendum for enhanced powers through the Silk 1 and 2 process, so the Welsh Assembly will have those competences. And that will mean that there will be that increased pressure. I think, but there can be the marrying of two principles. I mean, for one element, for example, where we were having some cross-party discussions with the Labour Party, I mean, from our perspective, I think it was quite interesting that we were able to listen to a strong view that says that it's important that there is the continuation of proper representation from Scotland on a per capita basis in UK institutions. So that the response is not just to continually reduce the number of Westminster parliamentarians from Scotland and Wales. The response is actually to reform the institution that they're being sent to. And what that will do is, I think that de facto, Westminster by 2020 will in effect become much more like a federal parliament. At the same time, I think we do have to look at the functioning of ministers when they operate with that, because in many cases it's actually how the ministers operate when their functions are UK-wide functions, or those that are almost exclusively as a health or education minister for England now, previously England and Wales. And I think that is the challenge for how the civil service operate for it. So we're almost looking as that will be almost top of the agenda for the conference of the new union, because that is an absolute imperative that makes sure that by 2020 this will be resolved.
Alex?
Yeah, to be honest, I find the West Lothian question is often oversimplified. And what I mean by that is we don't have a choice between either the perfect union or no union. Any democratic model will always have quirks. That will be anomalies. But I think the other point about the West Lothian question, it's purely not just a Scotland and a UK issue. And neither is it a Welsh and UK issue, or indeed a Northern Ireland UK issue. We have devolution in London, so it's about the role of London MPs and in the UK Parliament. More and more devolution being discussed around the regions in terms of local government. I refer back again to the city deals, and also the next wave of localism that's coming both from the current UK government and has been spoken of by the Leader of the Opposition as well. So I think it's easy to oversimplify it as just being Scots having influence over legislation in different parts of the United Kingdom. The other point about it as well is, even though there are certain pieces of legislation that in terms of the actions of that legislation affect only certain parts of the country, given the way the funding model is set up, almost every decision has spending consequentials on other parts of the United Kingdom. Take the tuition fees vote as a perfect example. It was a vote that, fair enough, we didn't introduce tuition fees in Scotland, but it still had a funding element, which meant reduced money for tuition in Scotland as well.
Maybe it was the Barnett consequentials for the Mersey tunnels that prompted you to be voting for
I'm sure that was it. I'm sure that was it.
Absolutely. Can I, before opening up, just one final question. You all used the word settlement destination. Is that actually possible to talk about? I mean, and also in that is the question of what would be a decisive result on September the 18th? I mean, what would enable a settlement of the debate for some time to come? And is it therefore really possible to talk about that? Or is one talking about another interim stage before the debate inevitably opens up again for whatever reason? I mean, you could see, for example, if the UK voted in a referendum to leave the EU, that could well open up the whole devolution debate very easily.
Curiously, certainly strategists for Yes Scotland are very much of the opinion that if they lose, they lose. That even if it's a very close result, it's a loss. Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, has said that in her view that it would be over for a generation, but a generation is 15 years. Which is an interesting interpretation of generation, but leaving that to one side. Personally, to answer your question about the result, personally, I think it's going to be closer than probably it ought to be, and that it could have been. And I think that's where my argument about coming together with a very precise, distinct offering that was going to be in all three Unionist Party manifestos next year, where the wording was agreed and it was in place, I think would have been the ultimate killer blow for the nationalist argument in Scotland. The first part of your question, Peter, was?
Well, the idea, therefore, of how valid is the idea of a settlement?
Yes, in my mind, the missing word that from the debate from the Scottish Parliament so far that would have created that settlement is accountability. I think part of the reason why we have had this gradual chiselling away at the original 1999 situation, 1998 Scotland Act, and the supplementing of it is because we haven't had that accountability, and successive attempts have been made to gradually try and improve it. Whether it's Calman, which was a fairly small, but nonetheless in some cases significant improvement to accountability, but certainly the proposals that are on the table now will be a very substantial improvement, but they are still going to be significantly less than 50% of money spent by the Scottish Parliament raised by that Parliament. I also think there is one little thing just to throw into that. In some of the party proposals, including my own, there is the assignation of tax revenues, and in order to try and bump up that accountability. And I just think we need to be careful about implying that simply assigning a proportion of, for example, VAT revenue creates some magical increase in accountability in Scotland, because in my mind, unless actually politicians are responsible for setting the rates and making the tough, if you like, making the hard yards of setting taxes, are they actually truly reflecting upon the implications of some of the spending decisions they make?
Thanks. Jeremy?
I think it's two elements. I think that it is important. I call it kind of the destination of devolution. That's not meant to say that everything will then be in perfect harmony and there'll be no disputes, because there's no entity around the world, federal or not, that doesn't have turf wars or battles between them. That's normal, that's natural. But not many other countries use it as a reason for one part of it to be independent. And therefore, I think it's important to really get to the stage where there is an overall cross-party agreement as to where it is the natural home for some of the powers that lie. For example, currency, pension, employment law, and where it is natural that there are areas that are delivered by a different sphere of government. And because I think without that, then you will be perpetually in an argument where part of a nationalist narrative is to say, well, because we have the NHS devolved to the Scottish Parliament, it automatically follows that pensions should be. Or because we have housing, it automatically follows that some element of another welfare. Now, they are non sequiturs in my view, but it's harder to rebut that unless those that support a union has the narrative to explain why these are better. And I think that the prize is to have the cross-party agreement on why they exist. I think that the Scottish Party leaders doing that is a very significant step, especially when you think from parties that come from very different backgrounds with different objectives as far as policy outcomes are concerned. So that's why I mean by the destination. That's why I think a refreshed union can be a more contented union, because there is an intellectual basis upon why one sphere of power has responsibility and another one hasn't. And then finally, about what makes it conclusive. Well, I think that it's not necessarily about numbers. It is about whether or not an alternative mandate was given when people vote no. If people vote no, and they know in doing so what will happen as an alternative, that is a much stronger mandate than any one of us saying it has to be 35, 65, 30, 70 or 51, 49 will do it. I think that actually we're in the phase of post-referendum. It'll be much easier for there to be an acknowledgement of going forward without having to have another referendum if people think independence has been rejected, but I am satisfied that there is an alternative way forward with the other parties. That's our responsibility, and I think we've made some real progress on that.
I'm not going to put a figure on what result makes it decisive and it doesn't go back, but I think given the level of heat and hate that we've had in the debate, given the levels of divisions that have creeped into Scotland, I think it's a responsibility on all of us to accept the result as the settled will of the people of Scotland. So that's why myself and my own party have made a commitment that if Scotland does vote yes on the 18th of September, we won't be campaigning for a reversal of a yes vote. We will accept the will of the Scottish people and work with anyone to try and make independence work the best we can. And the challenge that we make to the nationalists is the exact same. If Scotland votes no in September, will they accept the result, end the campaign for independence and work with us to make devolution work? And we haven't had a firm commitment on that yet. Some say it'll be a generation, some say it'll be a political generation, some say it'll be 2 parliaments. There is no clarity on what that means. And the final point on that, Peter, is if you actually look at the subtleties of the Calman proposals, I don't see devolution as being this is the end point, job done, line in the sand, going back to what Ruth Davidson said. Neither do I see it as being actually this is the next story, and in 5 years' time or 10 years' time we'll all have commissions again and we'll see what the next phase looks like of further power after that, because that then leads you down on a very dangerous road indeed. But if you actually look at the details of the Calman process, what it promotes is cooperation between both governments. So accepting what the new settled will is in terms of that devolution settlement, but then 2 governments agreeing that they work in partnership, and also the powers existing for temporary switching of powers and swapping of powers if there is a demand or a need to meet local needs in Scotland or indeed in the rest of the UK.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Now, I want to open it out to the audience here for your questions following up on his themes. We've had some very interesting stuff. Philip, and could you say, here you are.
My name is Philip Stevens. I write for the Financial Times. The question, I have 2 questions, but the first is a sort of obvious one, that the unionist parties, and I take it from you 3 today, seem to be saying that the way to strengthen the union, if there's a no vote on September the 18th, is to have less of the union. Everything is about transferring power from Westminster to Edinburgh. And that's said that, you know, the strength of the union is where the capacity to pool resources in areas where you need to. And here's the naive bit of my question. Are there any areas where we should be pooling resources, as it were, where we're not now? Or is strengthening the union just going to be having less of the union? And the second question is, if it is a no vote and there is substantial devolution, doesn't that change the dynamics of Scottish politics quite considerably? And I suppose the obvious question is, doesn't it give a huge fillip to a centre-right party that can say, yes, we can now have the conversation not just about how much we're going to spend, but how much tax people want to pay. So could this be the revival, the moment of revival for the Conservative Party in Scotland?
Well, I think on that one, Peter, you've got to answer that. I mean, you've been waiting to hear that question for a long time.
About 50 years. To answer the second question, could it be the rival? I think some scenarios in the result in September, you know, that could have emerged on September 19th, would have potentially been existential questions for the Scottish National position, the Scottish National Party position. I mean, actually, there is very little that keeps there is almost nothing that keeps the Scottish National Party together, whether it's John Swinney and Sandra White, or Fergus Ewing and Nicola Sturgeon. The only thing they have in common is a belief in Scottish independence. Yeah. And if you take the prospect of Scottish independence off the table, then in my book, a potential scenario with a resounding no victory in September would have been you take the pack of cards in Scotland and throw them up in the air, I think, and see what happens. Because there are people who would find themselves in what they would see as being the wrong place in such a scenario. I have to say, in my remarks earlier on, I think it's going to be closer than it should be, and closer than I would wish. And on that basis, I think that existential question for the Scottish National Party is probably not going to come up just as quite as strongly as it would otherwise have done. Another question, Philip, on the potential reversal of devolution. Are there any areas where devolution should be legalistic? Yeah. Indeed. I think Anas actually put it quite well when he said, you know, there should just be a very pragmatic response as to where powers should best lie. And I think there are some, for example, in some of the areas where Sewell motions have been used, have indicated that perhaps there may be a more appropriate place for certain powers to lie in the longer term. But I think it should be a pragmatic analysis. My analysis is that for the first time in the political generation, my party started to talk the right language, and we've started to see where this debate is going to end up, and it's going to end up with a Scotland that is part of the UK, but is very self-determinant in the way in which it runs its economy and its day-to-day public services. And I think that is a recognition that's probably only 50 years out of date, but we've got there in the end.
I don't see it framed as less of the union, because in actual fact, I don't see the debate over where power should lie and how best you practice your democracy as representative of what our union is about. I see it as a sharing union, and that's why I talk about the pooling and sharing of resources being that fundamental principle for the union as well. It's a union that shares a history, it shares security, and also based upon that pooling and sharing resources shares prosperity as well. And I suppose as a social democrat, I come at it thinking, I don't want to just redistribute the wealth of 5 million people, I want to redistribute the wealth of 60 million people. Because I think that best helps you achieve that social democratic outcome. And the other point is, actually, we have a really unique model in the United Kingdom, where you have 4 very distinct nations, 4 very proud nations who recognise in certain issues they work together. So it doesn't undermine our nationhood, it doesn't undermine our identity, but certain things are better done in partnership. One perfect example of that being our single market. So the largest and longest border that we have in the whole of Europe is between Norway and Sweden. Norway, a country the nationalists often quote, but Norway only does 8% of its business or trade with its nearest neighbour, Sweden. Scotland does 66% of its business with England. We trade twice as much with the rest of the United Kingdom than we do with the whole of the rest of the world combined. That, I think, is more representative of our union rather than which building has what power and what politician has what power. So I don't see it as a strengthening of our, I don't see it as a lessening of our union. I actually see it as a reaffirmation of our union, but still recognising our nationhood and our identity. On the second point about, which is more a question for John, absolutely, but if you actually look at the politics in Scotland, if you look at it away from the bubble of the UK context, or you look at it away from the bubble of the constitutional context, we actually have very unprogressive policies happening in Scotland which are undermining some of that social fabric in Scotland. I'll give you just 2 practical examples of that. Despite the fact that we do not have tuition fees in Scotland, if you're from a working class background, you're less likely to go to college or university if you live in Scotland than if you live in another part of the United Kingdom. And we've seen a massive undermining of our college estate, where 145,000 places have gone in Scotland alone, and that is the poorest and most vulnerable people that are losing out on those places. Colleges often being the route from them to university or indeed to employment. And a second one, despite us not having the huge reforms that have happened in England around our NHS, which has pulled us from pillar to post in terms of what's happening with the setup of the NHS, in Scotland our health inequalities are actually widening, not narrowing. Even though we have an independent NHS in Scotland that still benefits from the pooling and sharing, health inequalities are widening, and in some parts of our country, life expectancy is actually falling. So yes, we have free personal care in Scotland, but take parts of my constituency, 50% of people won't live long enough to get free personal care. So there is some very unprogressive things happening in Scotland. There are some very centre-right things happening in Scotland, as is, and I'm sure it's for John to answer whether it's a revitalisation.
No, Peter, you wanted to come quickly back before I bring in Joe.
Just one more aspect to Philip's question I didn't address, and that is the opportunity for the centre-right, if there are going to be devolution of tax powers, to frame the debate differently or to characterise your question. I think that's right. I think there is an opportunity, although I think it is not. I mean, I think in the short term it will probably allow the party to go into elections promising a tax position that is perhaps different from an established consensus in Scotland. But I think the opportunity actually is slightly different in the longer term, and that is to become more relaxed about letting go of tax powers to Scotland. the vast majority of members in the Conservative Party in Scotland are hostile to devolution of taxpayers to Scotland at the grassroots because they believe that taxes will go up as a result. But actually, if you look at the evidence since devolution, there isn't much evidence to suggest that that's actually what would happen. I mean, if you look at council tax, for example, it's been frozen for 7 years. Not actually, I would say, a very progressive policy, as it happens. But so if you look at where powers have been devolved, then actually there has not been that social democratic, perhaps expected increase in tax rates that you probably expect. And I think one of the encouraging things is for the centre-right to become more relaxed about devolving tax powers, because actually the evidence is that we'll just have the debates at a more local level, and that's a good thing.
Jeremy.
I often think that there's one thing that does divide us, some of my good friends here, is that I think we've got two unionists and a federalist, so I actually don't call myself a unionist. And it's not just semantics, it's actually because I do think it is important to have to explain why the federal unions exist, and there's a reason why they exist, and these unions, whether or not it's broadcasting or social protection or defence or currency, why they are strong. And I actually think that to some extent, yes, Scotland is doing our case a favour, because the referendum, a key element of it, is actually them making the case of why these unions exist. Part of the difference is that, as I said before in my opening remarks, that in many respects they wish to leave them and then rejoin them. So they must see merit in them. I think that they should exist, and you have to explain why they exist. You asked about, Philip, about areas where you may consider pooling. Well, I found, interestingly, the term that I was in the Scottish Parliament, it was at the early days of having to discuss legislation about climate change. And it was a decision made in Holyrood that it made sense, and the SNP subsequently in government accepted this, interestingly, was it made sense for the scientific research to be carried out on a UK basis that had informed the Scottish Parliament. Now, the Scottish Parliament had an opportunity of establishing its own scientific base, because many of the legislative competences to address climate change were devolved, but it made sense. Similarly, when it came to new technologies for both cybercrime and on web-based issues, made absolute sense for this to be done across the UK. And increasingly, I'd say it's more on a European level as well. So the beauty of a more federal structure is that it does allow that to happen. Now, it is certainly not the motive behind my work to provide a basis of which the Conservatives have a renaissance in Scotland. That is not the underlying motive. But one of the motives is that we do, to some extent, normalise elections to the Scottish Parliament, the way that the Parliament functions. But interestingly enough, Peter was my Conservative opponent in the last election, and we both lost. So, I mean, we're united. We're united in that. But I wasn't challenged about how policies would be paid for necessarily. I wasn't challenged about the choices that would have to be made. And that's not in any of our interests if we actually wish to make a case as to why our policies are best for Scotland. We've managed to create an artificially benign Scottish Parliament that almost cannot make any difficult choices because it's always someone else's fault. And I'm suspicious of political institutions that can do no wrong. And I think that means that the ones that you find that are in countries where we can look back near history that is not the best model for us. So I do think that the accountability is there. But the accountability is not the default to say, and I don't buy the argument that, oh, you get accountability, then everybody's going to vote Conservative because no one likes paying taxes. No, I don't mean that you're saying it, but that's part of a bit of what's kind of put forward. As actually, I mean, for Joanne Lamont had made a very good speech, challenging about can we afford some of the choices being made. Willie Rennie's made similar areas. I don't think we'll ever progress that argument unless people understand that there is the interaction with the taxes that are paid and the choices that are made to deliver it.
Right. More questions. Right. Well, I'll take them bunched in 2 or 3, and we've got about 20 minutes there. Lady there.
Hi, Lindsay McCallum from Westminster Advisors. I'm interested in accountability and how all of you have referred to this as being central to your various commissions. I think that's a really interesting perspective in terms of where we go from now and devolution. But I just want to reflect more on how nationalism has grown in Scotland and the respective parties, whether you see that's because electorates have become disillusioned potentially, because Holyrood actually has quite a lot of powers, but a lot of Scottish electorate maybe aren't necessarily always aware of the level of powers that do exist. And so do you sort of take responsibility or want to reflect on how nationalism has grown and how you would approach it now within your own parties, not just from a fiscal autonomy perspective, but just going forward, you know, post-Novo?
Okay, yep. Take question the two there, and then I'll come to the back.
David Phillips, Institute for Fiscal Studies. So I have two questions, and the first is on the fiscal side of things, and it's about this idea of devolving income tax, but not certain other taxes. Peter mentioned that he thought that when devolving income tax, it's natural to devolve corporation tax as well, because many companies pay both. Isn't it more natural to think about devolving national insurance, because they're much more closely linked to income tax? And of course, the issue there is that national insurance is wrapped up in this idea of a social welfare union. But could Scotland be lumbered with a tax that could be cut? Income tax has been cut progressively over the last few years, but without access to taxes that have been increased. National insurance, the kind of Labour's choice tax increase, and VAT, which is the Conservatives' choice increase in the last couple of years. So would it really actually give Scotland the power to raise spending as well as cut spending? And secondly, different thing entirely, is federalism possible in a country where England is 85% of the population?
Right, yeah, that is a big one, which vaguely has been raised before in debates a century ago. Yep.
Robert Morland, I'm a former Conservative member of the European Parliament, actually for Staffordshire, but I was, as a child, in Glasgow for 8 years, and you will see on my biographical details Bearsden Academy, so I hope I qualify today. I just wanted to follow up just 2 points. The very quick one which Peter made, which is, I would go further than him about, both of my questions are really critical of our party, in that the actual decline of the Conservatives started in the 50s, in that in the mid-50s it had half the seats in Scotland and indeed in Glasgow, and then fell back in 59, whereas in England Macmillan was romping, and from then, romping on, so to speak, with votes. And from then on, it actually lost at pretty well every election worse. And so a lot of it was to do with the vision of the Scots on our economic position as well, and the loss of the middle classes, which I think does make it very difficult for us. The second point, which is quite simply, I didn't think the panel went very far on. Maybe because of my European background, I'm very concerned about if you go further than your opposition, you feed it, which I'm obviously thinking of my own party in relation to UKIP. And I have a certain feeling, if I go back to the 90s, a lot of the argument about the devolution was, if we do this, it will see off the Scottish nationalists, but it obviously hasn't. And shouldn't that still be a worry?
Right, actually very interesting. I'll come to you in a second. Linked in terms of cultural issues there, the growth of nationalism, the decline of, I should say, unionism in Scotland in the long term since 55, when it was when the Tories or Scottish Unionists won half the seats, and the attitudes of that, and then the variety of tax questions. Start with you, Jeremy.
Just Lindsay's point first. I think if Professor Curtis was here, he'd probably be able to show a long stretch of charts that probably shows that nationalism in Scotland maybe not has shifted a massive amount. So it's whether or not you always say that the vote for the SNP equates to nationalist voting. I suspect, and one of the reasons why I started to be concerned when I was first in the Scottish Parliament, was that if you do have a very major imbalance in the level of choices made and accountability, it might not necessarily feed a nationalist argument, but it certainly feeds a political imperative to fight political battles with another entity rather than actually be rewarded for the benefit for the success of your own policies. So therefore, part of my worry is that if this is not addressed, why would a successive Labour or Liberal Democrat administration in Scotland do anything differently than thinking, I'm going to be rewarded more by the electorate in Scotland for creating a spat with Westminster rather than delivering far better schools? To some, you may argue that we're already seeing a plateauing of schooling in Scotland, NHS, or party political. So I think that that's where you start to get what economists might call moral hazard creeping in. I think we have that, and that is why I think that there is the imbalance. When you have clearly a situation with identity that plays into that, then it's very easy to overlay nationalism on top of that. I think that's very easy. On David's point, it's an interesting point, I think, on the if the overall imperative of devolving the taxes or having the taxes the authority of the Parliament is that they will do it purely simply for revenue raising, then I think that there's certainly a case for that. But I think in a more federal type structure, it isn't just that. But I think that there's the bigger benefit is that the electorate understands that the majority of the revenue that's being paid in Scotland is going to the Scottish Parliament. And actually that has a bigger impact than simply picking one tax and using that as the lever to raise the revenue. And I think that is from our thinking, that is the better imperative. It's a much stronger situation to say the majority of taxes that are being paid in Scotland do accrue to the Scottish Parliament. And that unlocks the issues to do with a lot of the political debate that exists. And there has to be that transaction. I mean, people in Scotland at the moment, even though there's the tax power that exists, when they pay their income tax, when they pay all the tax, they don't have the Scottish Government badge on it. They have HMRC, they have the UK Government badge on it. It does skew the relationship when you're having that transaction of paying over. I'm relaxed about, finally, the point about can you have a federal system with a very large England and the smaller nations. That's why I said that what I would maybe call British federalism recognises the relationship between the nations. It's not a case of subdividing England. But Prince Edward Island, 125,000, and Ontario, 12 million. Canada can accommodate that. It's just that no one, but certainly the authorities and the representation that Prince Edward Island have feel as if they are protected under the North America Acts and the Canadian Constitution. And that's an important characteristic that means that nations of the different sizes still have a feeling of equity within the Constitution.
Three really good questions. Lindsay, your question, I could spend all day answering that one because I think it oversimplifies to say that the rise of nationalism goes hand in hand with the rise of the SNP. Actually, I think it's two very, very different things. That's why Jeremy referred to some of the polling analysis that John Curtis has done. When the SNP won their election in 2007 for the first time, for that first 2 years, despite the fact that you had an SNP government, a first ever SNP government, despite the fact that they were at the height of their popularity as a government, it was actually the lowest point in generations in terms of support for independence at the same time, because people saw them as a competent government that was fighting for Scotland, that stood up for Scotland, rather than an engine towards independence. And even in the 2011 election, 35% of those people that voted SNP have said that they intended to vote no in the referendum, because the SNP very openly said, vote for us now and you have the option of voting no in any referendum in terms of independence. In terms of why the rise of nationalism happened, or the SNP has happened, is I think my party has to take a large part of the blame for that, if not the vast majority, if not all of it, the blame for that as well. Because if you look at the result we had in 2010, and I've openly said this before, so it's not any kind of breaking news, is in 2010 you had a choice between a very poor Labour Party and the Tories, and Scotland would always prefer a very poor Labour Party over the Tories. And so we had 1 million votes in Scotland and had a rather good election in a Scottish sense in the 2010 general election. The choice in 2011 was a very poor Labour Party or the SNP, and Scotland chose to vote for the SNP instead. And that's why we have a responsibility through this referendum debate, and indeed in the build-up to both 2015 and 2016, is to rebuild our own party so once again it can meet the aspirations of the people of Scotland and stand up with a credible platform of what change looks like for Scotland and what a vision of an outward-looking, positive, social democratic, progressive Scotland is in the 21st century. And that's something that we see as a massive responsibility for us going into 2015 and 2016. On the David's question about the taxes, you mentioned two very specific taxes, one on corporation tax and the other one on national insurance, both ruled out by our own devolution commission. And the reason why they're ruled out, two very different reasons for both. One on corporation tax, the measure of success for the Labour Party is very different in terms of the measure of success for the Conservative Party. We don't believe in tax competition across the UK. We don't believe in having a tax competition where Scotland could cut corporation tax, England then follows suit, and then you have the good undercut by the bad undercut by the worse, and the only people that win out from it are the large corporations, meaning less money coming in your tax base and less money to then spend on your schools, your hospitals, and on employability programmes. And that's why we don't support the devolution of corporation tax. We think it's right for it to be consistent across the UK. On national insurance, that goes back to the pooling and sharing of resources argument. Over 70% of people polled in Scotland and indeed across the UK say that one of the strongest suits of the UK is that shared equal pension right across the UK, shared equal employment benefits across the UK, that shared resource and pooling argument again across the UK, and a good symbol of that is national insurance, and that's why we think it's right if welfare is to predominantly stay as part of the UK institutions, if pensions are to stay as part of that UK institutions, and also the pooling and sharing of resources so you can maximise spend on the NHS stays across the UK, then it's right to keep national insurance at a UK level as well.
Right, great. Peter, particularly on the last question, so I want to get into in the remaining 5 minutes another couple of questions.
Indeed, a couple of things on David's question about corporation tax and national insurance. You're right, there are different arguments in different areas. I mean, I would commend to you, if you haven't read it, the Devolution Plus proposal from Reform Scotland, which gave a rationale for those taxes that could and would not be devolved. So VAT, because it couldn't be, national insurance, because there is a link to the pensions in welfare pot. So there's arguments both ways, but I think it's useful to approach the argument from that direction. To introduce just a little bit of debate, it's always good to have an argument now and again with Anas. I mean, I find the Labour Party's position on corporation tax difficult to understand personally, because first of all, the logical extension of an argument that says we should have the same rate of corporation tax across the UK is to say, well, we should have one corporation tax across the EU or across the world. At some point, there's got to be difference. At some point, politicians have got to be challenged to come up with decisions. And I think you've got in your mind, Anas, I think what you have to do is separate out the decision to transfer the power to set corporation tax to a Holyrood Parliament from any natural assumption that would automatically go down or automatically go up. It's perfectly possible there'd be a consensus to raise corporation tax in Scotland. There would be no reason why that consensus couldn't emerge. And finally, I'll take the unionist question that you asked, John, I think it wasn't, Robert, apologies, because it's probably my patch, that one. I think what you've got to separate out the 50s and 60s, because I think in those days, frankly, it wasn't a Conservative majority in Scotland, it was a Unionist party majority in Scotland. I think you have to take that to one side. In my mind, the decline has really started in the early 70s through the current day.
Right. Take three more. We've got, sorry, any three. There are two there. There's one over here and one at the back. Okay, and I'll one there.
Thank you. My name's John Cartledge. An earlier questioner asked about possibilities for reverse devolution. Can I just suggest, I'm not sure if this qualifies as that one policy that would be hugely popular with a lot of citizens of a certain age is if there was a single Britain-wide concessionary bus pass rather than 4 mutually exclusive national schemes. It's ironic that there's reciprocal recognition of bus passes between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but not between the 4 parts of Britain. However, my question is about devolution of income tax. Scotland already has tax-raising powers, and it hasn't used them. It hasn't used them because they're supplementary powers. They would require augmenting the current level of taxation that's charged Britain-wide. Now, if you give tax powers to Scotland, which are merely to change the address to which you send the cheque, so that instead of paying it to London, you pay it to Edinburgh, but the amount you pay is the same, what practical difference does that make? What do you achieve? It's merely an administrative complication. unless a Scottish power is at a government in future is going to be prepared to bite the bullet and raise more tax than the current ones have shown any inclination to do, it's very difficult to see what practical change would result.
Sure. Gentleman behind you. And could you make it terribly brief, please? Just one sentence, that's all.
So Paul Doyle from the Treasury. It's just a question about accountability and what we actually mean by accountability in this context. Because I think it's interesting in the UK, there are quite strong third external forces that provide accountability in the UK Parliament, from the media but also from think tanks. And I think our experience in Scotland from running the Scotland Analysis Programme from the UK government is that we haven't faced the sort of challenge, critique that we would expect and indeed welcome in Scotland of the sort of arguments that we're making. You could argue that providing more powers will generate the demand for that, but equally you might politely say that there's an underlying reluctance from third parties in Scotland to challenge the Scottish government.
Yeah, I see where you've come from. Gentleman at the back. No, okay, fine. Here, up here, please. George.
I'm George Robertson. I sometimes wonder how the Independent Scotland, or even, you know, my own party, is going to do this great redistribution in Scotland, because in Scotland, the number paying the upper rate of tax, that is the number of people earning over £150,000 a year, is only 13,000. So it's not going to be very easy to soak the rich in order to distribute it. And in fact, the burden would be on the middle taxpayers. And Middle Scotland is actually, as I know only too well, very, very similar in its antipathy to taxes to Middle England as well. But the question I was really going to ask is that the mistake I think about this debate generally in England has been that we have not posed the question to people in England as to why devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has actually been so popular, when we were told by a lot of people before devolution came in that it was going to be unpopular. And the one aspect of the way we'll need to look at post-no Britain and the way it's run is to look at the House of Lords in the context of what happens next. It's not simply the West Lothian question in the House of Commons. It's really, where does the Lords fit into that? And that actually gives you scope for more inventive thinking in terms of the thinking that will go on afterwards.
Thanks, George. And one final one. Robin. Yeah, you get your question.
Thanks, Peter. My name's Robin Rowe. I work here at the Institute for Government. I'm also from Scotland. And I was up there last year visiting, or last week in fact, visiting some family who are unfortunately all yes voters. Not because they believe in independence, but because they want further devolution. And when I put to them that we already have this agreement between the three unionist parties that if you vote no, you will get further devolution, they said, well, of course, they would say that, wouldn't they? And I just wanted to ask the panel what they think needs to be done between now and the referendum on the 18th to really reinforce the point with the Scottish voters that if you vote no, you will get further devolution. Because I do feel that at the moment, it's either they're not aware of it or they just simply don't believe what's on offer. Thanks,
Robin, very much indeed. Right, we have four big questions there, but if you could be brief on doing it. Jeremy.
If I take them in order and try and rattle through them then, I think for John's element about the bus passes, I was aboard as MSP, I was born in Berwick, right on the border. You sounded a little bit like my parents then, because that's their constant gripe to me. We resolved it in the borders by including a hospital route, so that there is agreement between the two that if you need to get a bus to go to hospital, so one of the most popular bus routes that's cross-border goes past the Borders General Hospital for pensioners who are perfectly fit and healthy. It's about getting the two governments working together. It's not constitutional. Income tax, I was the only MSP that's activated the mechanism to put forward a motion to use it. It was to cut it. To some extent, it was to make a point in the Scottish Parliament. It's an almost unusable mechanism that we have at the moment for the very good reasons that you indicated, and that's why I think we are looking at devolving income tax so that it is both that you pay the income tax to the Scottish Parliament, but then there is the credibility that the the rates are all devolved so that you can have the kind of debate that's not just about, I mean, I agree entirely with George about soaking the rich. There isn't even the same statistical bandings to cover the number of people who own over £200,000 in Scotland because there's so few of them considered. So I think there's an element of concern that there is among my good friend in the Labour Party for that.
And always relying on George to be helpful.
Yes. Paul's point, the authentic view from the Treasury. I think it's been really worrying that there's been some commentary by the SNP that says that the OBR is in effect just the Treasury, and that was very recent. And I think that's really worrying because it's been a good innovation to have the OBR. I would love there to be a Scottish OBR. I would love there to be more independent think tanks that do a function of scrutiny and challenge. I think it's really important. The Scottish Parliament's responsible for raising the majority of its revenue. I'm confident that that will start. And then finally on Robin's point, just very quickly for George, the House of Lords, yes, there was a 1918 conference that former Prime Minister sat about making the House of Lords more geographically representative, and I think that is part of the debates going forward, I think, are really valid. But finally, we need volume, we need repetition, and we need sincerity. For those of us that believe that there's a positive future, that there will be mechanisms in place, that we will deliver our policies, we have to be strong and shout about it. We have to do it often before the referendum, and we have to mean it.
Right, Peter.
Your Treasury comment about almost the quality of debate is I think the point behind the observation you make. I mean, I have to say, I think one of the major disappointments there has been about the last, whatever it's been, 2 years of substantive, or 20 years, of this debate has been the quality of it. And actually, it's been far too easy, I have to say, on both sides, to be very dismissive and very resort to this cliched responses, when actually there's some issues here we really need to get to the bottom of. And I think if there's a major regret in the way in which some of your work, sir, has been cast aside by some, not all, some, then I think that it's reflective of the quality, or the poor quality of the debate we've had. The unionist pre-agreement, Robin, your observation there, what more can be done? I mean, to be honest, without being pessimistic about it, my personal observation is that bus has passed us. I have to say, if a single major joint agreement was to be made, and we seem to be proactive, we seem to be, this is our vision for New Scotland, then personally, I think that should have happened well over a year ago. I don't think less than 90 days prior to the vote gives any of the right narrative to that kind of statement. It seems to be reactive, it seems to be desperate, rather than proactive and optimistic. And I would rather it had been determined at a much earlier stage. On George's comment about why devolution is popular, well, it's a Conservative. You won't forgive me for saying we certainly underestimated the popularity of devolution. That is certainly the case. I mean, to be honest, part of it is about, it's just a recognition that Scotland is different. I mean, there is a difference. Absolutely. There is a national identity. I would argue it's not a nationalist identity. And I think for too long we haven't responded to that. And I think also the reason why your question, forgive me, I didn't answer it earlier on, why the nationalist position is as high as it is I think we have let the politics of grievance fester without replying to it for too long. And one of the questions that perhaps Better Together has to answer is why, if on a long-term basis, support for the SNP and independence has been in the order of 25 to 30%, why are we currently in the kind of 39 to 44%? That seems to be about somewhere there's been a failure to get that message across.
Thanks.
Four good questions again. John, on the bus passes, I think that's a good one. We'll take it back to our policy forums. I imagine it's where who pays for it is the big question that will come from colleagues in all layers of government. On the income tax powers, I think it does feed back into the accountability argument in terms of the Nationalists have already said that they would align the existing tax arrangements even in the event of independence, so they wouldn't see an increase of income tax post-independence. Now, I don't believe that to be true. I mean, you look at IFS studies that show that the 6 billion black hole that would exist on day one when Scotland becomes, if Scotland was to become an independent country. But the reason why I think it's important is accountability in terms of raising your own money. So you do have a debate, not just on spending, but also on raising as well as spending money at elections, which I think is important. And secondly, the bogeyman of blaming either Westminster or blaming local government for taking the decision and saying actually we're making the right decisions in the middle. We're either not getting the money the right way from the big guys above us, or when we're giving it to the wee guys and not spending it properly. I promise we're doing the right thing in the middle. I think having that tax and spend debate at an election, and also on your tax receipt actually seeing Scottish rate of income tax, makes it a very different frame for an individual and their relationship with the Scottish Parliament itself. Paul, I think a really important question about accountability, particularly in the context of a majority government. So the Scottish Parliament that was supposedly not designed for majority government, where you were going to have a consensual basis of doing politics in terms of the way the Parliament is designed, and also by the committee structures, you've seen that completely fall apart when you've got a majority using that majority in the committee structures to stifle debate, using it to vote down critical points in any kind of report, and no space for minority reports to go in terms of scrutinising the actions of government. The non-existence of an OBR to look at Scotland's spending and the impact it's having, I think that's a much more longer term debate about how do you, in the absence of a revising chamber, in the absence of that independent scrutiny analysis, and in the absence of a functioning committee structure, how do you ensure you have a level of accountability in Scotland so governments are rightfully tested? From our own Labour days, and George can back me up on this one, we had lots of Labour backbenchers willing to give a hard time very, very easily to Labour politicians in government. You don't have that in the Nationalists at the moment. They're very much in control of the message and eyes on the prize of the referendum. Now we'll wait and see what happens if that changes post the referendum debate itself. George's question on why popular. I think part of the popularity of devolution is a national identity. So it goes back to Peter's point about not necessarily nationalism, but a rising of national identity. I think power being closer to home, having your own parliament, making your own decisions nearby has a resonance and an affinity that people have to it, and I think that's why they've bought into devolution. Also meeting local circumstances, and the end of the smoking ban is a good example of when we didn't just shape policy in Scotland, but we helped shape policy for the rest of the United Kingdom as well in a transformative way. And on Robin's point about further devolution, I don't share the same pessimism as Peter. In fact, it was John Curtis, that famous analyst again that we're mentioning, who actually in a conversation that he had when he came to give evidence to our devolution commission said that actually when it comes to the crunch, it's probably about a 2% swing related to that further powers guarantee, because people are making the decision based not purely on whether they're going to get more powers or not. They're going to make a decision based upon identity. They're going to make a decision based upon whether they think they're going to be personally better off or worse off when they make that vote on the 18th of September. But I think reaffirming what has been said by Jeremy, we've got to make sure we say it with sincerity. We've got to make it bang on about it consistently between now and the 18th of September. And that's why not just the three political parties have made the more powers guaranteed, but you'll see Ed Miliband in particular, and also Joanne Lamont from a Labour Party perspective, re-emphasising that we guarantee to have a new Scotland Act in the first Queen's speech of the next Labour government, and also we'll make a signed pledge and a more powers guarantee post the referendum.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion of the unionist perspectives. I emphasise this is the first of two debates. There will be a second event on the 16th of July, 3 weeks' time, or 2 weeks' time rather, with representatives of the SNP and Plaid Cymru. We'll be putting a notice on that on the website shortly. So this is part of a longer-term project we're doing at the Institute, funded by the ECRC, carried out in partnership with the Future of UK and Scotland programme, led by Charlie Jeffrey at Edinburgh University. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panellists today, who've been very candid, very open, and have taken forward the debate. Peter Duncan, Jeremy Purvis, and Anna Salwa, who've really contributed and brought out many of the reasons why we at the Institute of Government are absolutely committed to looking at these issues, because we're doing the fundamental governance of the UK. So thank you all very much indeed.